humanity, that is not always the case, which is why the bill requires a safety evaluation. So this is, when I say light touch, I'm learning a lot about the politics of AI and the different warring factions and who calls whom a doomer and so on and so forth, which I've found. I've learned as a politician that politics actually infuses all aspects of life and all communities. So when we put this bill together, there were people who wanted me to put a requirement in that the state should have to issue a license, that you should have to get a license, permission from the government to train models above a certain size. I rejected that. I don't want the government involved in deciding what models can and can't be trained or released. There were people who wanted us to put very, very harsh liability into the bill, something called strict liability. Strict liability is a concept by which if you put out a product and it harms someone, you are automatically liable, even if you did everything right, everything reasonably. It's a strict liability, automatic liability. I rejected that. Some people wanted us to put a private right of action in, that if an AI model caused harm, anyone could file a lawsuit on that. I rejected that too. I thought that was too broad. And so there were a number of ways where I was very conscious and saying, I want this to be light touch. I don't want it to be harsh. And I want innovation to really continue with some sort of broad safety parameters. I think I talked about this already. And then the one other thing I want to just talk about before I hand it over to Ari to talk about some more nuts and bolts about, about impacts on developers. I want to talk about liability because some people have expressed concern about, oh, this is going to cause developers to fear liability, so they won't want to innovate. So I just want to be really sort of clear about this. Right now, today, if you are a developer creating a model, I mean, a large language model or a smaller, any model, and if you then release that model, gets deployed out into the world, and then someone uses it to do something that causes harm, that injures someone, or harms, does something that causes significant damage, property or personal damage, someone can file a lawsuit against you today. That's just basic, like what we call tort law, injury law. If you create someone and it plays a role in harming someone, that person can sue you. There are contours around the liability, and it can get fought out in court about what was your exact responsibility. Are you fully liable? Are you partially liable? Are you not liable? But you can be sued and dragged into litigation today. That is existing law that's been around for 100 years. Whether you're creating a physical product, whether you're creating a large language model, whatever the case may be, you can get sued. And so I think there's a little bit of a narrative, subtle narrative out there that there's no liability today, and SB 1047 creates liability, and that will change how developers operate. That is not true. You can be sued today. And in fact, the liability that we create in SB 1047 is profoundly more narrow and restrictive than existing liability. And that is that if a developer does not comply with SB 1047, if they're creating one of these huge models, don't do a safety evaluation, don't mitigate when indicated, and massive harm occurs, as outlined in the bill, because we're only talking about massive harms. There's only one human being, one person, entity, who can file a lawsuit, and that's the Attorney General of the state of California. Can't be some random lawyer, can't be an individual, can't even be the person who sustained injury from it. They might be under current law be able to sue, but under SB 1047, they can't sue. Only one person, the Attorney General, can sue. And we know just from how government works, when the Attorney General has the power to sue, say, an industry for violating environmental standards or safety standards, those law he or she will only file in the most extreme cases because they have to pick and choose. They have limited resources. And so I saw online some people saying SB 1047 is going to be the CEQA of AI. And for those who don't know, CEQA is a law in California that gets abused to sue people to stop housing or stop other things. And that's not true because unlike CEQA and other ways that you sue people, only the Attorney General can file a lawsuit. This can't be about people who are just trying to obstruct. And so we made it very, very narrow on purpose so that the Attorney General would really hold accountable people who engage in really egregious behavior. So anyway, I just want to put all of that out there so you can hear from me directly about what my goals are, what the bill does. As I said, there are times when as a legislator, when you say, this is what I want to do and here's my bill, and someone comes back and says, hey, this provision actually doesn't do what you're saying you intended to do, and maybe you shouldn't have this in here, or maybe it should be different. And we 100% eagerly welcome that kind of constructive feedback. So with that, I will turn it over to Ari. And I can drink my coffee now.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what this bill actually requires of developers. As the senator was just saying a couple of minutes ago, the covered model definition is really intended to primarily target just this very narrow group of developers who are really genuinely pushing the frontier forward. And importantly, these are companies that are, billion, if not trillion-dollar companies. We're talking about an extraordinarily small number of companies spending hundreds of millions of dollars to train their models. And so the answer for the vast majority of developers is you do not have any obligations under this bill. And I want to make that really, really clear. If you are tinkering with a model, you do not have any obligations of this bill. If you are a 3-person startup, you're not going to have obligations under this bill. And so really the question is, okay, you are literally Sundar Pichai. What do you have to do right now in order to comply with this bill? So what are the obligations that it's going to put on this small handful of companies? A couple of different things. First and foremost, the entire bill is structured around this idea of testing, because there's a lot that we don't know about the next generation of models. The bill is not saying we know what is going to come next, because no one knows what is going to come next. And that is why it is so important that you have better infrastructure in place to test the models, to learn what capabilities they have. And this is focusing on this extremely narrow subset of risks. The bill is looking just at these hazardous capabilities, like the ability to train a CBRN, so the ability to make it substantially easier to train a bioweapon, or a cyber attack on critical infrastructure that causes more than $500 million of damage. So we're testing for this extraordinarily narrow subset of extreme risks in these frontier models that are pushing the frontier forward. And the entire bill then is structured around proportional response based on what you actually find. In the majority of cases, the developers are going to find nothing, and then they're not going to have responsibilities under the bill. They'll test, they'll find that their model is not going to be dangerous in this narrow subset of ways, and then they won't have further obligations, even if they are in that frontier category. If they do find these extreme risks, if they are in fact coming into those dangerous categories, then they have additional obligations, right? So the types of things that you're going to need to do are going to be proportional to the amount of risk you're seeing. So you're going to need to have a plan for how the developer intends to address these risks. This is kind of similar to the types of the preparedness frameworks, the responsible scaling policies, and the things that you're seeing labs already starting to put forth. You're going to need to put in place safeguards if you do have these risks to make sure that they are not getting used or causing catastrophic harms. You're going to need to maintain info security to ensure that your model doesn't get stolen by a bad actor, but again, proportional to the amount of risk that you are actually seeing, and ensuring that you can shut down the models that are in your possession. There's been a bunch of confusion about this, so I just want to clarify again, the bill very specifically says that is only models that are in the developer's possession. This was explicitly designed to ensure that open source developers would not need to shut down models after they have been open sourced, because that is not possible, as people have reasonably pointed out online. That obviously introduces other risks, but the bill very clearly is not focusing on shutting down models outside of your possession, just those within the developer's possession. You cannot prevent 100% of risks, and the bill is not trying to do that. The bill is asking developers to reduce and minimize the risks. It is about managing and mitigating these risks, not eliminating it. There's a bunch of language all throughout the entire bill talking about things like providing reasonable assurance that your model is not going to cause a catastrophic harm. This concept of reasonable assurance in the bill is very intentionally pegged to industry standards and best practices and government guidelines that are coming out from organizations like the NIST AI Safety Institute, and coming out based on the things that are already being done in the labs. So again, this is not an attempt to say that you need to remove 100% of the risk, just that you need to do work to assure that this is not going to be an unreasonable amount of risk. And as the senator was just saying, developers already can be sued if they do in fact cause catastrophic harms of this size. And so this is not a new concept. Instead, what this is attempting to do is to enhance that legal clarity, to make it more clear that if developers do take this set of precautions, that they are going to, in the eyes of this law, at least in the eyes of the Attorney General, not be viewed as acting unreasonable. One of the questions that the senator is getting a lot is, why aren't you regulating the application layer, or why aren't you focusing on misuse risks and regulating the people who are intentionally misusing it? So very importantly, this is already illegal, right? If you take a model and you intentionally cause catastrophic harm with that model as an end user, you are already breaking the law, whether it is done with AI or whether it is done without AI. Unfortunately, that's not enough on its own to prevent the category of risks that we're talking about. The unfortunate reality is that if a terrorist organization wants to use an extraordinarily powerful model to cause catastrophic harm, to take out the electricity grid of the state of California, the fact that you've made that illegal is not going to stop them from doing it. And so there are some risks where you don't want to just sit around and wait to try to send someone to jail after it happens, because then the train's already left the station. And that's not necessarily the case for all risks, right? There's a really wide range of risks that you might be worrying about with language models and various different AI models that are coming out. And this bill is not attempting to address all of them. Obviously, there are a lot of really different important risks. This bill is not attempting to address misinformation. This bill is not attempting to address deepfakes. This bill is not trying to cover algorithmic bias. And you might want different approaches for different types of risks. You might want to say, some of these things can be handled on the application layer. Some of these things should be handled via targeting the people who are actually misusing the models, because maybe they're things that you can actually counteract after the fact, or maybe the things that are influenced primarily by the number of people who have adopted the model, or maybe they're things that there are other checkpoints along the way that you can mitigate against. But this bill is specifically looking at these extraordinarily hazardous capabilities that have the ability to cause catastrophic harm on a societal scale. And for things like this, you can't sit around and wait until after the harm has occurred. You can't expect the bad actors to care because you made it illegal. That's not going to be enough. And so, at least for this subset of risks, you need to take action at the place where you actually have some hope of managing to affect that risk. And the foundation model developers do have the ability to reduce this risk. Not the chance to eliminate it perfectly 100% of the risk, but there is a point of intervention where you can, in fact, make progress on reducing that risk. And you want a different approach depending on the type of risk. As the senator was already talking about, this is very lean enforcement. This is not a licensing regime, right? There's a bunch of people out there talking about how this requires prior approval from the government before you train your model. There's been a bunch of confusion about the certifications you have to do under the limited duty exemption. This is all self-assessed by the developers and reported to the government. There is no government checkpoint before you are allowed to proceed. This is relying on whistleblower protections from people at the labs to report information and the self-assessments from the developers in order to have the Attorney General receive that information and be able to act in the cases of extreme violations. And again, this is extremely light touch enforcement. The Attorney General under this law is not going to be able to investigate every minor infringement of these duties. The Attorney General is going to really only be looking into extraordinarily important cases because they have very limited capacity. And so they're going to be looking at things where there was a massive amount of harm caused. So they're going to be looking at things where there's imminent danger. And so this is a relatively light touch approach of enforcement compared to all sorts of other proposals that are out there. In particular, there's been a lot of talk about, does this criminalize making mistakes? Does it give perjury if you make a paperwork issue? And the answer is absolutely not. Honest mistakes are not considered perjury. There's been a bunch of other misinformation flowing around. The shutdown provisions we were already talking about, it doesn't criminalize open sourcing or doesn't cause licensing. People who are tinkering with models or application developers do not have obligations under this bill. This was not something written by big tech to entrench the incumbents, and there certainly isn't a fast track. It's been a 9-month process.
Can you hear me? Yeah, on that piece, I sort of smile every time I see online saying that this was written by big tech companies. That the big tech companies have not been cheerleading for this bill, to put it mildly, and their trade association TechNet has been opposing the bill, as well as other groups representing the big tech companies. So yeah, that's just not accurate.
Actually, back to you now.
Okay, so I think we're pretty much to question and answer. Let me just, so I told you, I mentioned this amendment about covered model. There are some other amendments too, so stay tuned. Those will be coming out, but that's one I wanted to definitely mention, clarifying that the shutdown requirement does not apply to open source models, and also that developers, if release a model and someone does make significant changes to it, significant fine tuning, you do not retain, you're not liable for that if someone has significantly changed your model. There's more work to be done around open source, and we're committed to that work, but we're trying to, really fine tune the bill to reflect some of that really excellent feedback we've received. So it just passed out of the Senate last year. It's now in the Assembly. For anyone who's ever been involved in the legislative process, when your bill goes to the second House, in my case as a senator of the Assembly, things get rougher and more complicated, and a lot of hard work happens in the second House. So normally bills get amended more in the second House than in the first House, just the way the process tends to work. So in June, this will be heard in a couple of committees. Those will be public committee hearings. And then we're in recess in July, but the work, it's not like vacation recess. The work continues. We're just not in session. And then if the bill is still around and still moving forward, the end of August is the end of our legislative session. That's when the curtain drops. And then the governor has to act on bills by the end of September. There are probably another 3 or 4 or more opportunities for the bill to be amended, and I'm pretty confident that that's what's going to happen. And so now is a great time, not just today, but in general. Feel free to message me, email my office, just be in touch about ideas you have and feedback that you have. Oh, and the bottom, that's very optimistic. SB 1047 becomes law. I've learned over time that bills have 1,000 ways of dying. So that's I wish I were able to predict the future. But if things go well, then that's when it would be law. Okay.
You want to call out folks for questions?
Sure, I could do it. Yeah, just don't get mad at me if I read by accident. So yes, sir.
I've been working full-time for Amazon for the last 2 years doing
work on open source and inference models. And this took us completely by surprise. And this took us completely by surprise. What parts of the open source community have you been talking to? Since the OSI hadn't heard about this until a few months ago, and Linux Foundation AI and Data Working Group hadn't heard about this until a couple of months ago. Who have you been talking to?
Well, Amazon was definitely aware, but Ari, do you want to?
Yeah, so there's been a very wide range of conversations with stakeholders. The reality is that there's a large number of people who want to weigh in, and that's certainly welcomed, but the Senator hasn't been able to meet with all of them, of course. But there have been conversations with lots of individual startups. There have been conversations with...
to be clear, I meet with a lot of people, but we have a team that also meets with a lot of people.
There have been conversations with a lot of the developers that are going to be actually under this bill. There have been ongoing conversations with great organizations like GitHub and different open source communities. So there's been a pretty wide range of stakeholder engagement. And also there are obviously lots of organizations who were not able to have one-on-one conversations. And I think the Senator is continuing to have those.
I would appreciate some sort of follow-up so I find out which open source communities you've been talking to. So it's not a big industry. We know each other on a first name basis.
Yeah, and like I said, Amazon was aware of this.
I'm not referring to Amazon. Yeah. I'm just referring to the Linux Foundation and the Open Source Initiative.
Sure, and we're happy to provide that, of course, but we also, going forward, there's plenty of opportunities for people to provide feedback, comment, provide ideas, and so we welcome that. Yes.
Hi, nice to meet you. Thanks for hosting. It looks like data is back that GDPR has essentially been a real headwind on innovation in Europe. How do you prevent this from doing the same with AI here?
Yeah, and this is not that, right? And so Europe, the EU does a lot of really good things that we don't do in this country, but the EU sometimes certainly regulates more extensively than the US does, and more than California does, and sometimes, at times may go a little too far. So this is not GDPR. This is literally what this bill does. Says if you are creating a huge, massive model, and we're clarifying that that'll be spending more than $100 million to train it, do a safety evaluation, which many labs are doing now. There's a lot of, you know this better than I do, and there's all sorts of summits happening and, collaborations among companies and labs about safety evaluations. And so we're not asking to do a safety evaluation that's different than the types that are already happening, and we understand it's an evolving field. But do the safety evaluation, and if it identifies a really, really serious risk, take reasonable steps to mitigate it. Doesn't mean you have to eliminate it. So it's a very, and then with extremely narrow liability for really egregious situations. So it's a different universe than GDPR. The EU has been much more micromanaging. This is not a micromanaging bill. Like I said, I could have put licensing in there. I was just like, no. That is micromanagement of innovation, and that's not what my goal is. Yes.
Hello.
I'll try to point more precisely.
I've worked in robotics using AI since 2016, and I always dreamed of that future where robots and AI did all the awful jobs so we could live better lives. I'm afraid that that's not the future we're headed towards. I think that I support SB 1047, but I'm worried that it's not strong enough. It's a good first step, but I think that this might be asking the foxes to police the henhouse. We've seen the OpenAI scandal recently. We've seen Google's AI safety people quitting or leaving. And we saw OpenAI muzzling anyone who might have something to say about their safety practices. If SB 1047 were law right now, would those people have come forward? Because speech is not free if you work at OpenAI. It costs many times your salary and equity, and it costs your voice as a shareholder. It costs you all that you have worked for the last however many years. So I worry that the whistleblower protections are not strong enough, and I worry that this is just self-policing and self-regulation with a couple more requirements. So I'd like to know how whistleblowers can feel safe, and how do we know that the safety precautions are not just a rubber stamp?
I mean, I think the safety precautions are real, and I think that's there's pushback against them, and so we're probably, no matter where we land on it, it's going to be too much for some perspectives and not enough for others. But we're trying to just sort of get it right in terms of where we land on the safety precautions. The whistleblower protections have been in there from the beginning. I think we're continually taking a look at them to see if they need to be modified, refined, and we welcome. I know the safety evaluation has been like the center of I think a lot of the debate that's happening around the bill. But I believe that the whistleblower protections in the bill are quite important, and so we want to get that right too. And so if you want to give us specific feedback, feel free to send it in on the whistleblower protections. We're happy to take a look at it because we want to get that right. Did you have a follow-up? So
you can DM us on Twitter to the Senator's page. You also feel free to reach out. We published an open letter. There's a website. We published an open letter on a website, opensecureai.com. safesecureai.org, and there is information in there to follow up.
Yeah. So and you can all, and if you message us on Twitter, X, whatever it's called now, we'll look at that too. Yeah.
I'm curious about the decision to remove the or equivalent benchmark performance clause from the covered models definition. So I understand that our benchmarks are basically really shitty right now, and in some sense that's part of the point of the bill, is making people test for these like high level capabilities that existing benchmarks don't cover. But also on the substance, morally speaking, it seems like the models we should be paying close attention to are extremely capable models that could cause various kinds of catastrophic harm, not precisely models that take 10 to the 26 flops or $100 million to train. Where like right now that feels like a decent proxy because existing systems aren't very capable. But as the science evolves, we might decide 10 to the 26 actually wasn't the right line in one direction or another. Maybe they're perfectly reasonable to be really laissez-faire about, or maybe like as hardware and algorithms improve, that line actually has to come down in order to meet the sort of moral bar of really capable models. So curious if there's like an amendment process or something like that.
Yeah, there's always an amendment process. But before I turn it over to Ari, regulating, I'm glad we're getting these diverse perspectives in the room because it's important. Regulating technology is always, as government regulating technology, it's always challenging. I don't think I'm gonna surprise anyone. It's hard for government to keep up with technological changes. That's been true forever, and it's true today. And that's why when we talk about what side do you err on, because one of the critiques we were getting of the equivalent capability, or whatever the phrase was, it was
no, it's for my husband.
Time,
he's just had surgery and he's having a
be
reaction to the painkillers.
And so on the one hand, yes, those smaller models may be more and more capable of doing amazingly good things, but also doing problematic things. On the other hand, it could sweep in, startups and people who are trying to experiment and innovate, and we want to make sure we're not chilling that startup work. So I don't pretend that the bill is like, it's not biblical. It's not, I'm not going to say everything about it is automatically perfect. We know that there are pros and cons to any choice we make about thresholds and otherwise. But I think the vagueness of that particular phrase was causing a lot of concern, and that's why we decided to make a shift there. I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are going to be costs and benefits in any threshold that you pick, right? In some ideal world, you might want to have a body that's able to update that threshold over time. We've seen other legislation coming out doing that in the EU, and there's different approaches to handle this. We wanted to have something that didn't require a ton of bureaucracy to get set up in the California government, and wanted to keep this relatively lean. And so it's hard to do that in a way that stays up to date over time without kind of creating this overly bloated institution. And so, yeah, I do think that there are costs and benefits of whichever side you go here. Obviously, that equivalently performing capabilities threshold was in there for the reason that you're bringing up here, right? Like, you do have this question of will smaller models over time end up being more powerful and causing risks, but there, I think, was very fair criticism that this would also sweep in a really large number of organizations sufficiently down the line. And so figuring out the right way to strike that balance is really important. And I think making sure that the bill doesn't accidentally include a lot of startups who are really genuinely innovating in the space is also very important.
Eric, you can call them people.
Yeah, hello. So a really important line in the bill is when models have hazardous capabilities. What are you imagining that looks like? As in, when models can no longer get a limited duty exemption, like the safety testing no longer, the safety testing no longer indicates things are fine. What do you imagine those models look like? What are they doing in the world? Yeah, any details here?
Yeah, sorry, can you clarify one more time?
Yeah, as in, there's an important threshold in the bill as in what counts as a hazardous capability, and at that point you have a bunch of requirements.
Yep.
What are you imagining those models look like? What are they able to do? Like, can you put more vision on what you're expecting?
Yeah, like what would count as a hazardous capability, and what would that really look like? Yeah. So I think the bill is trying to say that these are models that are really genuinely substantially making it easier to cause these catastrophic harms. So one important thing that is in this definition is it's not just if you can already cause this catastrophic harm, if you can do this with something out there on Google, then this would not count as a model that is really genuinely pushing that capability forward. So one important point is this comparison. That's really important because as well as civilizational defenses go up over time, you should expect to see what actually counts as hazardous shrinking. But I think that the goal for these hazardous capability definitions is looking at models that are really able to cause really broad societal scale risk, right? We're not talking about a model that can help write emails a little bit better to do your cyber attack. This is talking about models that are able to really genuinely advance those extraordinarily dangerous risks, and in this kind of very, very narrow set of categories.
I think are there specific thresholds in the bill?
Yeah, so the bill has kind of 3 different categories that it defines as hazardous capabilities. One is if the model is able to make it substantially easier to create a chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear weapon, substantially easier than otherwise would be without one of these models. The second is if you have a model that is able to autonomously commit crime that causes in a single incident more than $500 million of damage. The third is whether it is able to commit a cyber attack on critical infrastructure, again causing more than $500 million of damage. And really, this is kind of intended to say that there's a very, very small number of these extraordinarily dangerous categories that you want to take this particular approach with.
One more over here.
Thanks so much for coming today. One of the things I just want to briefly point out before getting to my question is that this has actually been a historically anomalous, safe deployment of technology. And in terms of the actual harms that have come, I think it's, for the most part, been blown way out of proportion. I'm a founder in the AI space, and one of the things that I noticed when the bill came out was the collection of people that you had found to sign on to the bill. In particular, the collection of people you found to sign on to the bill. In particular, it was very clear they do not represent my interests as a founder or other interests of founders I know in the ecosystem that I think that you very clearly want to help promote in the Bay. And so going forwards, my question for you is, what do you plan to do to find, to actually be able to sign on people that represents the interests of founders and other startups that are going to be driving the growth forward?
Yeah, and Ari can comment on this as well, but we do have, there are startups that are supporting the bill. You can go online and see who they are. I'll be honest with you, there are other startups and founders who we're aware do support the bill but don't want to be public about it for all the many reasons that people sometimes don't want to be public. Tomorrow I'm doing a roundtable with a significant group of founders who are not fans of the bill. And we're have an open door to more of those kinds of meetings. And I'm glad that people are focusing on the bill now. We, like I said, we tried to make this public last fall, and I'm not criticizing anyone because just because I say, hey, I want to do a bill doesn't mean everyone has to drop everything they're doing and start engaging with me. But we've been trying for 8 months now to get, try to induce engagement. That engagement is now happening, and I'm glad it's happening, and I'll continue to be available for that engagement. Not just me, but my team, a group of us.
So we're running out of time, so I'll take 2 or 3 more questions, and I'll start with you.
Wonderful. Hi, Scott. Jeremy Nixon, I represent...
Hold it closer to your mouth.
Sure thing. I'm Jeremy Nixon. I founded the sequence of AGI houses, which represent a tremendous number of founders and open source developers who mostly create side projects on the weekend, some of which involve fine tuning, some of which power, companies that end up raising, a tremendous amount of money. There's a sense in the community that in the end, we have a big question. Will open source models be allowed or not? And if I can kind of try to skip to the end of what happens after all of our back and forth deliberation, given that you're genuine about your intentions with the changes that you have in mind. The question I have is, assume that we have identical hazardous capabilities between state-of-the-art open source models and state-of-the-art closed source models, which I claim is currently more or less the case given the jailbreaking regime that has afflicted Claude 3 and GPT-4 and really every major closed source SOTA model. And if that continues to be the case, the big question is, can Meta release Llama 4 or Llama 3 400B and expect to not be sued by the Attorney General or otherwise punished because open source is essential to privacy? Lawmakers who, lawyers who have, agreements with their clients to maintain privilege, doctors who want to make sure they're not exposing their patients' data to Microsoft, to OpenAI, to Google, to Anthropic, depend on these open source models. And so if open source is not state of the art, doctors will not be able to give state-of-the-art medical care to their patients, and lawyers will not be able to give high-quality feedback to their clients. And so our question is, in the long run, assuming that hazardous capability is a wash because every model is jailbreakable, what will you do?
So, like I said, our intention, is we're not against open source, not trying to shut down open source. It's just, it's about the testing. And Meta is certainly, Meta, as I understand it, says that they are testing their LLM. That's my understanding. That's what I've seen them say. And so that's what they have to do. And so that the bill doesn't stop them from open sourcing it. And Meta, frankly, is in a better position than a smaller developer to do that testing. And so that's what we're asking of them, not to try to stop them from open sourcing their model. If you want to add anything.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I'd add here is I think you bring up a really good point that these are challenges that are not solved on either the closed or open source side, right? So I don't think that this is fundamentally a question about specifically open sourcing models. I think that, as everyone acknowledges, there are a bunch of really important open research questions, and luckily we still have time, right? I don't think the next generation of models is going to have anything like these extreme hazardous capabilities, and I think that the kind of opportunity is for these large developers, whether they are closed sourcing or open sourcing their models, to continue investing in precautions that make it actually reasonable to deploy these models in a way that is going to be safe And that's true whether they're closed sourcing or open sourcing their models. And I think that that's true no matter what the developer is doing.
With one more question, I'll go all the way back here.
Hi, I've got a question about fine-tuning and hazardous capabilities. So I understand your stance and your 3 points on hazardous capabilities. Now let's say you've got a clean model and you have some sort of proprietary chemical nuclear biology.
Hold it closer.
Sorry, you've got a clean model and you've got some sort of proprietary chemical, biological, or nuclear data from some research scientist, and all of a sudden you get your clean model and you fine-tune that on some proprietary data like that. Does that model all of a sudden get classified as a hazardous model? And if that is the case, how does the 10 to the power 26 flop baseline hold?
Yeah, just make sure I understand the question. So you're saying you have a model that has the CBRN ability as a hazardous capability, and then what was happening with the fine tuning in your story here?
So it's a clean model, and then you fine tune it on proprietary data that sort of, according to your definition, enables all of these hazardous capabilities.
Yeah. And your question, how does that tie to the flop threshold is the question here?
And does the base model that's clean also count as a hazardous model in that case?
So you're saying someone else fine tunes it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so fine tuning is one of the things that you do have to account for in the models, whether or not this is a closed or open source model. As the senator said earlier in some of the considerations, I think there is a really interesting question of at what amount of fine tuning do you want to consider the original developer still responsible? And so there's been some conversations online about how you could do indefinite fine tuning and create a completely different model. And I think that's very reasonable to say that there should be some point at which that liability switches.
And just to be more explicit on the fine tuning piece, there will be an amendment relating to that to acknowledge that at some point, if you as you put it, a clean model, at some point it's no longer your model because so many changes have been made to it. So stay tuned on that. In the next couple of weeks, you'll see the amendments that we're making.
Thanks. I've got a very quick follow-up.
Yes, of course.
You can, even within a certain threshold, I think keeping a threshold on how much fine-tuning you can do is not as important as keeping a threshold on what enables hazardous capabilities means. Because you can just train it on one piece of paper that provides very detailed instructions, but still doesn't change the weights too much. And that model can still, according to your definition, count as a hazardous model. And I think even a lot of 7TB, 7B models can still fall into that category.
Yeah, look, I think this is a really good, interesting question. So I think that if you have a model that is, that Meta spends $1 billion training at some point down the line to make it vastly easier to, in fact, create a CBRN, and then all it takes is someone spending $1,000 fine-tuning it to add a little bit of data here, then I do think that the answer is you don't want to say that Meta is entirely off the hook under some of these really, really extreme subsets of circumstances. That said, I think there's an important question of what is the subset of circumstances? What really genuinely counts as sufficiently advancing that capability? And I think lots and lots of capabilities are going to be general purpose capabilities that are not in fact hazardous capabilities. And so if all this is doing is making it easier for you to send emails to do a cyber attack, that's not a hazardous capability. But yes, I do think that there are some circumstances in which you want some of that responsibility to be on the original developer for how people downstream are using it.
That's how you then prevent models of being prolific. Like by defining a small amount of fine-tuning that then really hurts startups like us. By saying $5,000 worth of additional work, I think that's what that means.
Let's talk. In the back there, you had a...
Hi, so I just wanted to echo the previous comment. I also think that there's a real danger of authoritarianism if only the government and a few very powerful corporations have access to frontier AI models. because it means that as AI gets more and more involved in our lives, we're all having to expose extremely private data, not just about ourselves, but medical data, like sensitive legal data, to these organizations. And on another point is that the 10 to the power 26 flop limit also seems like we are fishing for a number to regulate, as opposed to like arriving at a number through like thorough consideration as like algorithms, strategies, hardware capabilities evolve. And it reminds me of like how encryption was like restricted to 50 bits for a long time. And it was classified as munitions, and that just resulted in a lot of weak encryption.
Yeah, so a couple things. Thank you for that. In terms of your last point, again, we're not banning. It's safety evaluation, and doesn't have to eliminate risk. It's a safety evaluation, and if it exposes an obvious risk, taking steps to mitigate it, not eliminate it. So we're not trying to ban. I understand there are concerns around open source. We're going to continue to work on that, and you have my commitment that we'll continue to work on open source. In terms of the authoritarianism, in terms of the government, what the government will receive here is basically a certification that we've done the safety testing, and it's not turning over data to the government. That's not what this is. This doesn't give the government any additional rights beyond what it may already have to obtain data. That's something I'm very sensitive to, and so I don't think it'll set up in terms of governmental authoritarianism that way. In terms of big corporations, that's an existing issue today. That I don't think this bill changes in any way, but that is a real issue that exists today. So, okay, we'll do one last question. Yeah.
I think it's an interesting question. So I really appreciate your consideration on this issue, and you've convinced me that you're not trying to ban open source AI, which I thought was the case before this. And it almost sounds like these regulations won't have much teeth at all, which I'm kind of happy about, but it also sounds like, okay, are we just opening the door for regulation? And basically how I think about, and how I think the kind of state of the art of how we should think about intelligence is the extended mind. And these tools are really an extension of our mind, and they can't really do anything other than help us think, right? They can't take actions, right? Only they have to call an API. They have to create data in a format that can call an API, right? But they're just auto-regressing on text, right? So it's really a thinking tool. So have you considered the perspective that any type of regulation on this is a form of thought police?
I mean, I have seen that. I've seen that argument online, and I've seen the code as speech argument online, and people can certainly make those arguments. I don't think this is thought policing. It's about doing a safety evaluation. We know that with speech there are limits. Speech is not unlimited. People can get sued for defamation. If you incite violence, that action can be taken against that. And so, in terms of what we're trying to do here is to avoid, a potential catastrophic situation. I don't think that's thought policing, but I appreciate that perspective, though.
Thank you. The senator has another engagement, so we really have to wrap up. I'm so sorry.
And please feel free to be in touch. We welcome it, and we especially welcome ideas. So thank you.
Yeah. Ari, could you give us the website one more time?
Yeah, it's I think it's securesafeai.org. I'll have to double check that and send it out afterwards. Safesecureai.org. All right, thank you.
Safesecureai.org. Safesecureai.org.